We are now officially actually starting, our journey, like we said, that we're going to start in the Gospels at the point where we're going to be starting today, where Jesus starts gathering his first disciples. And we're going to be starting there and going on a journey and asking ourselves, what does it mean? What does it look like to be a healthy church? Disciples of Jesus who do life together, fellowship together. How did they do it? And what does that mean for us? And so we're going to be covering the first few chapters in John today. He covers a lot of the early story. Picking up where we left off last week, where Jesus was in the wilderness. And he went from the Jordan, getting baptized in the Jordan. He went backwards into the wilderness. He gets tempted, and he has that experience, and now he's going back to the Jordan. And this is kind of the official launch, so to speak, of his ministry. And so we are going to be following along as Jesus makes his first disciples and to see what happens in that process. John chapter 139, Jesus goes back to the Jordan, and John is still there baptizing people. He has some disciples, and when he sees Jesus again, he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And he tells his followers, he's the one I've been talking about. You should go follow him. And the interesting thing is that only two of them did. We are stubborn people. And when you have the guy that you've been following telling you shouldn't be following me anymore because I'm here to point to him, you should go follow him, and only two of them did, that tells me something. So in John chapter 139, it says one of their names, Andrew. I think it's interesting that it only tells us it's like two of them. How hard would it have been to say the other name? But Andrew and some other guy that followed John, they come to Jesus and they start following him. And so Jesus is walking along and realizes at a certain point these guys are following him and have a desire to follow him. And he turns to him and he says, "What do you want?" And they say, "Where do you live?" Which I think it's not the first top priority question I'd have of Jesus. But they ask him, "Where do you live?" And he says in verse 39, "Come and you will see." So they came and they saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. Now this is probably, when we're asking the question, what do disciples do? This is probably the most obvious answer, and we could have made it at any point along this journey. But disciples spend time with Jesus and other disciples. And the spending time with Jesus thing, if you don't have that one down, you should probably get that one down. That's a pretty important thing, spending time with Jesus. But sometimes it's this other part that gets us hung up. And we've talked about this, how oftentimes church can become just a place that we go because that's where church is. And we come on Sunday morning and we think of church as hearing a message, singing some songs, and then we go home. And it may be not that different than if we go to a movie and we're just watching a show. We're going there for a purpose. We don't really care who the other people are. But that's not what church is. You see, from the very beginning, a person who had a desire to follow Jesus, one, they literally had to follow him because he wasn't staying put. He was going and he was on his way, so you literally had to follow him. But as you follow Jesus, you're also now in connection and communion with all of the other people who are following Jesus. And it's not just they're there too kind of thing, because Jesus instrumentally says, no, we're all doing life together. And you're going to be interacting closely with one another just in the same way that I'm going to be interacting closely with you. And so there, in the ministry of Jesus, there was different degrees of relationship. And so some of you might be hearing me say, like, I have to have the same exact type of relationship with every single person that goes to church with me. And that's not what I'm saying. Because Jesus didn't have the same type of relationship with everybody who followed him, or even everybody who he interacted with. And there was a lot of different levels. And so the first level that some have identified would be the community. Those are the people, if we put it in our situation, who aren't here. And in fact, they've never been here. They're out there. And it says of Jesus that he looked on them as sheep without a shepherd. He had compassion on them because they were lost. And so those are the people, that's our mission field. But then you have the crowd. The crowd is the people who came to see Jesus, to experience Jesus, but they didn't follow. And so these are the people, throughout the 8 years I've been here, there's been a lot of people who have come into this room on Sunday mornings who we never saw them again. And they would be the crowd. Those are people that are still potentially, they're out there. They're a little bit more because they've actually come at one point. So maybe there's a little bit more openness. They're part of our mission field as well. Then there's the congregation, and I mean, that's pretty obvious. That would be you. And, but at this level, okay, it's those who follow Jesus, but they don't understand. And they might be following him, they might be there, but they might be still in that back row. And I'm not saying anything about people who are in the back row. But in the case of Jesus, he didn't have like this technology. He did utilize acoustics, but he, if you're sitting in crowds of hundreds or thousands without amplification, with a bunch of people who maybe aren't the quietest, then you're probably missing a whole lot of stuff that Jesus says. You're not seeing a lot of stuff that Jesus does. And so you're following, but you're kind of following still from a distance. These would be more comparable to the people who occasionally come. Or the people out in the community who, if you ask them, do you have a church? They would say, yeah, I go to Emmanuel Baptist Church. But we haven't seen them in years. But they still think of this as their church. And so then you have the committed. And then these are the ones who are they're starting to go from the back, to creep in, and they start getting closer to Jesus. And so you see them come up occasionally in the Gospels. Like, Jesus doesn't just send out the 12 occasionally. Like, one time he sends out the 70. And you're like, who are the 70? It's these guys who were starting to get closer, and they were starting to get engaged. And then you had the core, who obviously were the 12. And these are the ones that Jesus just constantly poured himself into. And even within the 12, there were 4. Then sometimes Jesus took them aside and he told them certain things. And then out of the 4, sometimes there were just 3. And then there was 1. Anybody have any idea who the closest person to Jesus was in this life? John. And he doesn't say it explicitly. The way he refers to it in his gospel, he calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. But when you're at the Last Supper, who's the one leaning on Jesus' breast at his side? John. Who's the one when he's on the cross that Jesus entrusts his mother to? He had brothers and sisters. Who's the one he entrusted Mary to? John. So, if I'm going to listen to anybody talk about Jesus, it's going to be John. And he wrote a book, and he told us, I'm writing you and telling you all the things that Jesus did so that you will believe in him. And so it's important that we spend time with Jesus, but we also spend time with other disciples. But that's not going to look the same, case to case. But it's definitely not, we're just not a bunch of strangers who happen to come to the same place that we call church. And so we gotta build those relationships with each other. Second is disciples talk about Jesus with their relational circle. How many of you have things that you're excited about? The things that hobbies you enjoy? Do you keep them silent? No, you don't. You talk about them. It's an important aspect of relationship. That relationship is only as good as two people who are genuinely interested in getting to know each other. And so don't believe the lies when you go to your Thanksgiving gatherings with friends and family when they tell you, we can talk about anything except religion and politics. Guess what? If you're excited about religion or politics, don't let people tell you can't talk about religion or politics. That, you should come back and say, okay, but you can't talk about football, and you can't talk about turkey. Because it's just as arbitrary. If it's part of your life and it's important to you, of course you're going to talk about it. We've let people put these arbitrary rules on us. And so John chapter 1:41, he says he first found, and this is talking about Andrew, okay, he first found his own brother Simon and said to him, we have found the Messiah, which means Christ. He brought him to Jesus, and Jesus looked at him and said, you are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas, which means Peter, or rock. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Maybe you've never connected these dots. I'm going to connect them for you. Okay, Jesus goes to the Jordan River and he's baptized by John, the baptizer. Who is John to Jesus? His cousin. Family. John had two disciples that became Jesus' disciples. One was named Andrew. Andrew had a brother named Simon Peter. First thing that Andrew does when he decides to follow Jesus, and he goes and finds Peter. Hey, Peter, the Messiah we've been looking for? I think I found him. Peter joins up. So then it says Jesus finds Philip, who was from the same town as Andrew and Peter. Neighbors. And so when it says Jesus finds Philip, I wonder if it's really Andrew and Peter find, Philip. Philip finds Nathanael, who's a fellow Messiah seeker, and I would say he's probably his friend. James and John were Peter's partners in the fishing business. So you have co-workers. You see how this works? Oftentimes, we model evangelism after John's ministry instead of Jesus' ministry. When you think of evangelism, we often picture people being as obnoxious as they can. And that looks a lot like John, John was an eccentric guy. We have to keep in mind, though, that he was a prophet. And Jesus even said that, Isaiah prophesied about him. He's the voice of the one crying in the wilderness, pointing to the Messiah who's going to come. And Jesus said, if you're willing to receive it, he was Elijah, who was supposed to return, according to a prophecy. And so you know who he was dressed like? Elijah. You know what he did? He had for food? things that Elijah had. And so John was very eccentric and he was very controversial, getting in the Pharisees' face and calling them out directly. He was calling out the leadership, the political leadership, for their immorality. And you know, it's interesting because a lot of times if you ask people like what they associate Christianity with, it looks a lot like John the Baptizer. But you can see as Jesus starts his ministry, it's one of relationship. Yeah, were there times where Jesus picked up a whip and he started driving people out of the temple? Yeah, that happened too. Were there times where he got in the face of the Pharisees? Absolutely. But amongst the average person, I think he was an incredibly charismatic and friendly person. A very happy person, joyful person. And his disciples were people like that too. And so we're going to naturally talk about the things that we're excited about. And so then the next thing is that disciples answer questions and they invite. So when Philip finds Nathanael, he says, I think we found the one that the law and the prophets wrote about. Everyone's interested in where Jesus lives. Because they immediately, where's he from? Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? How many of you, and I'm not saying this to be mean, but how many of you can picture somebody saying, like, if you talk to somebody from Billions and you talked about it, what church do you go to? It's a great church, you know. Where's the church? Roundup. Can anything good come out of Roundup? You know, when I go for doctor's appointments and they ask, you know, where you live, you say Roundup. They say, I'm sorry, you know. But Nazareth was, you think of Roundup as a small town that has nothing. Nazareth was a town that truly, like, it had a few people in it, and that was it. Like, there was nothing. The idea that the Messiah would come out of Nazareth was ridiculous to them. That's not at all what you would expect. But, you know, there was an answer to the question, because not necessarily Nazareth, but you know who came from Galilee? Micah, Elijah, Jonah. There's some people who came from that region that, you know, they were names that hit the top of the charts, you know. And that they were already copying Jesus at this point. Nathanael asked a question, and Jesus, you know, they asked Jesus a question. He didn't answer their question, and instead just says, come and see. So now, you know, Nathanael asks a question. They don't answer his question. They say, come and see. How many of you feel like sometimes you maybe don't talk about Jesus because they might ask you a question? Did you know it's okay to not have an answer to their question? It's okay to say, you know, it's a really great question. Can I get back to you on that? Or, even better, you can do what they did, and they say, that's a really great question. Come and see. Why don't you come to church with me? And you know what? I'm perfectly okay with you coming to church with a friend and saying, hey, pastor, ask your question. I'm perfectly fine with that, because you know what I pray for every week? I pray that you guys will come through the door with people that you've invited to church. That's what I would love to see. Because that's the way this happens. Relationships. So they answer questions, and they invite. Now here's the question. Are you invited or crashing the party? So after Jesus had gathered his initial disciples, which at this point we have 7 that John's told us about, and maybe depending on when you put this wedding, maybe 4, maybe 7, And so it says Jesus was invited to a wedding in Cana and his disciples. Makes me wonder, it obviously had something to do with Jesus' family because his mom was there, his brothers were there, But when they say, Jesus, you got to come to the wedding, he's like, okay, is it okay if I bring my disciples with me? But it makes me kind of think this is another reason why I think that Jesus and his disciples were known as friendly people who were welcome in places because people liked being around them. And when I was in Utah, and for those of you who don't know, I spent a couple of years in Utah as a missionary to people within the LDS Church. We lived in a little town called Manti, which was 90% LDS and 0.5% Christian. But Manti, even though it was smaller, and believe it or not, it's actually bigger than Roundup, but it had one of the first temples that was built, and it's huge. And it was the host to, at the time, and they don't do it anymore, mostly because of what I'm going to tell you would happen there, is the Mormon Miracle Pageant. It's where they would reenact on the temple grounds the origins of their church. And thousands would come. And it would go on for a couple weeks. And so when you get a bunch of Mormons in one place, then you have Christians who have the idea, what would be great is if we get Christians that come from all over the place, and we use this event as an opportunity to confront people on the truth of Christianity and the falseness of Mormonism. And so that's where we were sent as a mission field. And I was always prone to go along with those kind of things, go to Temple Square, go to General Conference and talk to people or whatever. I did that on college campuses, just talking to people about Jesus. So I was very open to that when we went, but when we went, I felt like God said, don't do that. Don't do that. And one of the things he put in my head was, you don't see that place as holy, but they do. And they're going there for entertainment. How many of you, if you're going to the movies or you're going out and about and you're like having fun, you like to be confronted with somebody who's going to talk about something controversial that you have no idea who this person is? It's not something we enjoy, right? So these people became known as the protesters. That's what they were known as. And what I found, because we actually made the decision when this was going on, we actually left on vacation. And when we came back, people noticed that we left when all of the protesters came. And it opened doors of conversation for me with my neighbors, with some of my coworkers. And then all of a sudden, they started building a relationship with me, and then they started inviting me to things that I had no business being there. And, so I got personally invited by my prominent Mormon neighbors to this kind of like insiders gathering of Mormon people, and they were introducing me to bishops and people that were higher up within the organization, allowing me to build relationship with them as a Christian missionary that's there to reach them for Jesus. It's the very type of event, they weren't there this time, it's the very type of event that the protesters usually would be outside confronting them with pamphlets and information. And when you get to General Conference, which they hold, once a year, twice a year in Salt Lake City, the Christians do even more obnoxious things. They're there with bullhorns. They're there with shirts that say josephlie.com. They're there waving their holy undergarments that they wear into the temple in front of them. That's not what Christians do. What Christians do is you build relationships with people that build bridges so that you can talk to them about Jesus. That doesn't mean that there might be an occasion in which God just tells you, I want you to go and talk to that stranger. Or I want you guys to specifically go out on the college campus and just start inviting people, because not too long from now, I'm just going to start walking around town with invites, to different things. And I'm going to invite you guys, if you want to come with me, to come with me. To walk and to pray and to do that. But the question that experience brought to my mind is, are we invited? Do we have a relationship? Are we building something that can go somewhere? Or are we just crashing the party? Because that's how I would describe what those protesters were doing. They just show up uninvited, unwelcomed, and get in people's faces. And so now their association with Christianity is the angry people, right? And like I said, looking a lot like John's ministry. So lastly, disciples get baptized and they baptize people. So in John chapter 3, after this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. And then in John chapter 4, verse 2, he gives us this insight, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples. When I was going for my master's degree, years and years ago, I had done an internship at my church for a few years before that. And I heard that you can apply for retro credit, for the internship. So I was trying to speed up my process. And I applied for this. And they not only rejected my application, but then they yelled at me because they read about me baptizing people without a license or being ordained. And I'd never even heard of this. I never even knew that this was a thing. For me, it was always as simple as what Jesus says in Matthew 28, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Behold, I'm with you to the end of the age." That's the Great Commission. It's given to all of us. It's not given to select people who are approved and have gone through the proper training and are given the authority to be able to do this stuff. So when there's a baptism in this church, I always ask two questions. When do you want to get baptized? And who do you want to baptize you? And I'm going to tell you about one of the coolest things that I've ever experienced in ministry. My previous church, we were working with the youth group, and they got this. They got this. This whole build relationships, and you have relationships with unsaved people, and you can be out there and invite them. And they started inviting them, and they started coming to youth group, and they started accepting the gospel. And then there was a bunch of them that said, "We want to get baptized." And so we wanted to do something really special. So we had it at the beach, and we had a beach day. And we invited the church. Some people came, but it's okay because something occurred to me as I was kind of putting it together in the order, is that every single one of them was linked to the other. Meaning that you had friends who invited friends, who then became Christians, who then invited a friend who became a Christian. And so when we did the baptisms, I baptized the first one, and then they went on the other side, and then they helped me baptize their friend. And then they went on the other side and they helped me baptize their friend. And it was an unbroken chain through 16 of these youth group kids. It was, I have it on video, it comes up in my Facebook memories every year. Seriously, one of the coolest things I've ever experienced in ministry. And that's exactly how this works. And so, you have this, salmon thing. And all the basic questions that we're still, trying to get from you. If we don't have your birthday's anniversary, all that kind of stuff, you can let us know about that. If you don't get our emails every week, and you're not on the email list, that means we don't have your email. So, put that on there. If you're new here, like I said, please fill this out. Love to get to know you. But a couple of questions. Number 8, are you interested in getting baptized? And so if you have taken the step, you are a believer in Jesus Christ, you believe he died for your sins, you believe he rose from the dead, then the next thing, if you haven't done it yet, is that we're told to get baptized. And so please let us know if that's you. And then you notice the little natural tear-off piece. And this is for everybody, and this is for you to tear off and to take home. And what I want you to do with it is I want you to put it in a prominent place where you're going to see it all the time. Because it's an opportunity for you to write down who are the people in your life that God has placed there in your relational world who don't know Jesus. And what I want you to do is I want you to pray with this list and write down the names that God reveals to you. And I want you to put it in a prominent place, and when you see it, I want you to pray for them. Pray that God would open up their eyes, open up their heart, that he would draw them to himself, and that if he wants to use you in the process, that he would give you the opportunity to do it.